pre-420 social equity conversation of reality, especially Roz and her staff at Minorities for Medical Marijuana, but also Classiques, MedFarm, Curio Wellness, BipoCan, Cresco Labs, True Leaf, Blizzy Cannabis Magazine, Marijuana Hall of Fame, Blackwall Capital, Curaleaf, Canopy Growth, Columbia Care, Bridge West, and Vicente Cedarburg. In the cannabis industry, many of us are drinking from a well that we didn't dig. Because of that, we find ourselves in a crisis of cannabis fair play. This crisis has come about because those who were victims and casualties, communities and people of the war on drugs were left out of the cannabis industry initially. This crisis is a realization by many thoughtful groups and individuals that something has to be done, and social equity is and can be a value-added pathway, as well as a corporate community engagement bridge and tool to start to do something process. This industry is and will continue to be a billion-dollar industry. In Colorado alone last year, revenues were up over $2.2 billion. Other states that are legal have increasing state revenues, and new legal states, when up and running, will have significant cannabis cash funds that can be targeted for allocation. I often say that the reason we don't know what social equity looks like as a society is because historically we've never seen it. Many have tried to confuse social equity with diversity, inclusion, and equality. And for that reason, some real quick definitions. Diversity is a numerical representation of different types of people. There's a diversity on this Zoom call, not all white or black or brown, but different numbers from each group. Inclusion is defined as the action or state of including or being included within a group or structure. Unlike diversity, inclusion involves an authentic, empowered participation and a true sense of belonging. Under this thinking, inclusion may be defined a definite step towards equity, but even those who feel included may not experience equity. Equality is equal access to resources, schools, jobs, transportation, and healthcare. So if equity is not diversity and inclusion or equality, then what is it? It is something deeper and more complex. It's about each of us getting what we need to survive or succeed. Access to opportunity, networks, resources, and support based on where we are and where we want to go. Social equity is really each of us reaching our full potential and getting the support that is needed to realize that potential. Some frequently asked questions then are, how do you get to social equity? Where do you start? How will you know? And my response is social equity is like democracy. It is elusive. However, there are some recognition steps that you can take if you are authentic about the commitment to social equity and you have the will to step up. Those recognitions are a recognition and awareness of past abuses, restrictions, barriers, war on drugs, institutional and systemic racism, lack of capital. Another recognition would be the need for equity capacity building and to identify access points for opportunity. And a third recognition of the need for equity sustainability with authentic relationship, sponsorships, accountability, and not just a one-time engagement. To assist us with this clarification and definitions, I've asked Dr. Sharon Bailey, educator, anthropologist, and social equity expert, to present a Black community perspective on social equity. Dr. Bailey.
Good afternoon, all. John has given me 10 minutes to frame the need for social equity, so I'm going to give it a go. Before we can understand the what of social equity, it's important to understand the why and why the business role is so critical at this point. To do this, we must see the truths in the reality we have created. I've been lost for words in trying to describe the current landscape. It's like being trapped in a surreal, nightmarish B-movie. We are all swirling in a tragic and traumatic storm of the COVID-19 pandemic, an ongoing racial pandemic stoked by notions of white nationalism and supremacy, an economic recession fueling hunger and homelessness, political violence, mass shootings, blatant attacks on voting rights, conspiracy theories, sedition, and insurrection. And I believe that each and every one of us is experiencing some level of trauma around the future of democracy. For Black and Brown folks, we're talking about intergenerational exhaustion. Some say we are at a tipping point or on a knife's edge, as Dr. Eddie Glaude from Princeton University has expressed. At a national level, the paralysis of our political and economic systems and denials by some in high places that systemic racism even exists sheds light on our ability to address, sheds doubt on our ability to address any of our major challenges as a nation related to race and social equity. As the anthropologist social scientist, I've been searching for a conceptual lens through which I could define what we are experiencing. How do we define this moment? What is the meaning of this moment? What is the zeitgeist or the spirit of the times? And I will contend that we are living in an era of necropolitics. Necropolitics is the use of social and political power to dictate how some people may live and how some must die. We see it in the intersection of the COVID and racial pandemics and the disproportionate impact on communities of color, access to testing and vaccines. We see it in the politicization of health guidelines science says will keep us alive. We see it in the way that Black and brown people became the frontline expendables in the midst of the storm. We see it in the rise of domestic terrorism and the proliferation of gun violence in our schools, on our streets, in our workplaces, in our temples of faith, and in our shopping centers. We saw it on January 6th when lives and our democracy were threatened, forcing congressional leaders and other public servants to purchase bulletproof vests and request extra security to do the people's work. We see it in the outrage over police killings and the Black and brown despair that piles up with each body that gets snuffed out on video and streamed on social media. Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, observes that what our nation is experiencing today is not an aberration. We find ourselves in this dangerous place, not because something radically different has occurred in our nation's politics, but because so much has remained the same. America's in trouble, and a lot of trouble, and perhaps most of it has to do with race. Our current civil and cultural wars come at a time when our country, indeed the world, is already in a state of emergency. Dr. King, in his book, Where Do We Go From Here, Community or Chaos, writes that we are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. So where are we really in respect to issues related to social equity? Are we still losing ground? Are we too late? Several years ago, the Losing Ground Project of the Rocky Mountain PBS iNews Network analyzed 60 years of US Census and other longitudinal data to uncover disturbing trends of growing inequality between Black and Latino citizens and their white counterparts across the country. They found that when it comes to some of the most important measures of social progress, income, poverty, education, and home ownership, the gaps between minorities and whites in the US are worse now than they were before the civil rights movement. The gaps in the nation's economy have been widening for years. The Brookings Institute and others report that no progress has been made in reducing income and wealth equality between Black and brown white households over the past 70 years. When attention is given to the gaps in racial equity reflected in wealth and other critical areas, we must recognize how the history of oppression and ongoing discrimination in the labor market, educational institutions, the housing market, and the criminal justice system maintain and exacerbate racial inequity. As our nation continues to define itself, we have an opportunity to address these inequities and shape our democracy to work better for everyone, not just the privileged race, the wealthiest, or the politically connected. Today, we must ask whether a thoughtful, meaningful, coordinated effort can ever reverse these trends. In addition, we'll have to consider whether we even have the vision, will, and courage to transform our nation into one that truly embraces fairness and justice. These are critical questions. We hear a lot about social equity, And the fact is, we really don't know what social equity looks like as a society because historically, we've never had it, we've never seen it. So we have to be the leaders we need. We have to be the change we want to see. We particularly need our corporate leaders to move beyond the belief that their only purpose is to make money for stakeholders. My advice to entities in all sectors, including the cannabis industry, on this score is to recognize that it's impossible to wall off their workplaces from the realities that shape the lives of their workers on a daily basis. To achieve equity in our landscape, organizations must first recognize the barriers created by institutional and systemic racism. Secondly, they must build in their organizations the capacity to support equity. And finally, these efforts have to be sustainable through transparency and accountability. It is incumbent on leaders to carve out these spaces and build a pipeline that draws on talent of the world we live in. The most transformative organizations, regardless of sector, must try to find ways to meet our challenges around race, class, and other barriers by building cultures that value our differences and support human dignity. As part of a commitment to pursuing racial and social equity, leaders will have to put in the work to learn and think deeply about how they can better advocate for and uplift diverse talent within their workplaces and communities. It's also clear that collective action that brings together public, private, social sector stakeholders is a muscular and promising way to create broad, permanent change. Such an approach would draw on the experiences and expertise of racial equity organizations and Black communities and amplify their considerable strengths and capabilities. It's only together that we, our communities, our nation can move from this dark night of despair to a new day of hope. And despite this gloomy scenario, I still tend to be a hopeaholic, and I do see hope for social equity on the horizon. Finally, no matter where you sit in today's landscape, as you reflect on the why and the what of social equity, here are some key questions that we must all ask ourselves if we're going to help our broken country heal. What does the concept of social equity mean to you? Are there social equity concerns in your community? If so, what are they? When it comes to achieving social equity, do your values line up with the redistribution of wealth and resources? Is everyone entitled to a certain quality and standard of living? Do you believe in dignity for all? What do you need to unlearn? What do you need to learn? And what are you going to do to support social equity? Is the ideal of social equity on your top 10 lists of concerns? Why or why not? Our nation is crying out for action, positive change, and healing. We must remember that in order to gather the consciousness and strength to deal with these dark moments, we have to actually remember to let in the light that is right in front of us. Cornel West has reminded us to never forget that social justice and social equity are both what love looks like in public. There's a responsibility we all have to move towards meaningful and lasting change. All people want is to live in a fair society, and I don't think that's too much to ask. The time has come for America to save itself, to save our democracy, and so we must critically consider what we must do from here and what happens if we do nothing. Thank you for your time and attention.
I know what you're saying, Roz.